early, but sure.
I can do it if you want. Morning, everybody. Welcome to the first session of the first day. This is DELEG, and I guess we're expecting another 2,500 of our closest friends. For those who don't know me, I'm Brian. This is my co-chair, Dwayne, and Tommy's hiding down here in the front rows. These two are the ones who keep me in line, so if I screw anything up, you know who to go talk to. A couple of administrative things first. Note well, hopefully everybody has read these things and they understand it as well as you should. If you do have questions, find any of your nearest, IETF friends. Our AD is sitting over here. He should know everything verbatim, so I would go to him first. The other part of this that we find very important is the anti-harassment parts. So please make sure that everything is being done with respect and decorum when we have these conversations. Hopefully this is old hat by now. Everything is driven through MeetEcho. All the meetings are recorded. You need to be signed in order to participate, in order to get in the mic line. If you are in the room, please keep your audio and video off. For the remote participants, use your audio and video when you are, either presenting or getting into the mic line.
Brian, it still says no session ongoing. The MeetEcho.
Oh. Then
Yeah, there's no data tracker at the moment and people are working on it, but yeah. Fixed again? Okay.
All right, well, Dwayne and I will keep an eye on the mics. So if people do have comments or questions and they can't get in on the data tracker or on MeetEcho, we will manage. For those of you who are remote, put something in the chat if you need something relayed at the mic, and we will operate on the fly. Various things are available for this meeting. We have the agenda up on the data tracker, if you can get to the data tracker, and all the various other fun things. So you might be able to report the issues with the data tracker. We could try. So this is our agenda for today. Curious if anybody has any updates or changes they would like to make. I do know that we made a little bit of changes yesterday, but hopefully it covers all the same material we had discussed on the mailing list for this meeting. So any last second changes to the agenda? All right, then let's roll. The first topic is Taylor is going to come up and tell us all about the changes to the requirements document.
Looks like it's pointed at you. Hi, everybody. Working group last call. Thank you. In seriousness, we don't really need 15 minutes to cover this topic, I don't think. 1.5 would probably do. So Tim went ahead and based on what we perceived to be a pretty successful interim that coalesced on pretty widespread agreement on the basics of everything. He did make a couple of minor edits. I expect for noting that he cleaned up my text, but nonetheless, there it is. And in retribution, I will point out that, Tim, you should link the code changes in the GitHub to the issue that you closed, especially when you can't get to the data tracker. But with all that said, We did adopt the numbering convention of being able to mark things as whether it was a hard requirement or soft requirement to make it easier for people to discuss. A couple of other minor wording changes. We basically feel like we're ready to go and that people can start focusing on how different protocol solutions align with the draft or not, which will be future talks here. And Brian just informed me this morning that, even when we go through working draft last call, so for one, if you have any additional comments, of course, last call does not mean that it is closed to editing. We will be able to incorporate them. But also, apparently, the intent is to kind of keep it open as a working group document moving forward rather than just, pushing it along to ossified as a published document. And I don't really think I have anything else to say about it. Dwayne, Brian?
I don't either, but I see Tim is in the queue. Looks like the queue is sort of working.
Okay. Thanks, Wayne. I just wanted to thank Dave for volunteering to get up and speak. Thank you, Dave. You had no choice in the matter, so I guess that worked. But yeah, I think we addressed every issue. Maybe we didn't talk about every requirement, but I think most of them are pretty straightforward, as people have said. So, and I put the link to the GitHub in the chat, so folks can reach that directly. That's it.
The one thing, Tim, that I tried to look up but couldn't before the meeting started was, is that text still in there about client-side update? Because that seemed to be most of the controversy was whether do we include that or not. Even though I was one who originally put it in based on some hackathon discussions, frankly, I don't really strongly care whether it's in there because to the extent that it is something that a draft addresses saying, oh, we will use, generalized notify for updates or whatever. A draft can still put it in independent of whether it appeared in the requirements. So if it's still there and people still object to it being there, we can take it out. Just mention that during last call.
Oh, thanks. I believe it's still in there.
Yeah.
We do still have an open issue on it, but I'm going through this. I think we maybe have wanted to simplify it so it's not so precise. Is that a good way to put it?
Okay. Cleaned up, you mean to say?
Yes, cleaned up.
Okay, awesome. No chocolate for you. Okay, thank you, everybody.
So what Dwayne and I will do is we will start a working group last call on the mailing list soon after this meeting, for some definition of soon, and hopefully people will make comments and provide any feedback that they want to see before we move forward. All right, next up is Paul. He's going to talk about a couple of different topics. What I will say is the things that Paul is talking about, we don't think that it's relevant to the requirements document itself. It's more things that we need to consider as we talk about implementations. So we'll probably just hold everything until, for any clarifying comments or questions for Paul, let him get through both presentations, and then we can do a few minutes of Q&A if people have clarifying questions. Cool.
And by the way, the data tracker does seem to be working for more and more people now. So please do sign in so we get the right size room the next time.
Paul, delegation models?
Delegation models first. By the way, this feels really weird. Okay, so this first discussion is something that's already been on the list with very little comment, which I'm hoping means people at least agree with the definitions. What this presentation is about is trying to make sure that we agree about all of the possible delegation models before we start working, before we get too far into working on the protocols. None of this is a requirement, but in fact, it's something that we want everyone, there's been plenty of discussion over the last year about which models people want. So if we have them cleanly in our head when we start actually doing the discussion of protocols, people can say, but I want this model and your current draft does or does not cover that. Next slide. I started a draft. This is absolutely not going to be an RFC. I did it just so that people could poke at it, and it will expire. And given that I only did it last month and we hopefully will be into protocol development soon, I'll just let it expire. But the idea here is if people who have an opinion about what the model should be don't speak up about it until halfway or 3/4 of the way through the protocol development, then we're going to get a messy protocol. We're going to get a protocol with stuff tacked on. So please think about this stuff now. Next. One of the things everyone's like, oh, delegation is, used by such and such. Let's not go there. Delegation is useful to DNS resolvers, and there are other things that we might consider. Oh, researchers like to look at the delegation information stuff. That's not at all core to the protocol definition. The protocol really, really should be, this thing is announced, and a resolver will look at that and then do something different than it's doing today. Next. So there are 3 models that are, like right now we all know what the NS, or I shouldn't say we all know what the NS model is. Each of us in the room has an opinion about what the NS model is, and there are probably, they could probably be ganged into 3 or 4 different buckets. But the reason we're having a DELEG working group at all is to be able to change the model. And so the 3 models that I have described, and if there are more than these 3, that would be really appropriate to hear, but so far that hasn't come up on the mailing list, is the direct model. The parent is the one who delegates. By the way, there's a slide on each of these, and then we'll be done. Indirect, which is the parent gives a hint to the, to where the child is, and then the child says, here's how, delegation should happen. And then the mixed model, which is the parent might give some delegation information, the child might give some delegation information, and it's up to the resolver to figure out how to mix them. So let's go through the 3. The first is parent delegates. So in this one, DELEG records only are in responses from the parent. That is, if you see a DELEG record anywhere else, it's either an error, you might want to log it, you might just want to ignore it. But in this model, for anyone who's following the model, the child never publishes a DELEG record. Next slide. In the indirect model, the parent includes hint records to where is the child. And then at that point, you say, oh, look, there are DELEG records there. And therefore, when I say you here, I mean the resolver. The resolver sees those and then says, great, I see those. Now, if the parent gives a hint and DELEG records, then the resolver ignores the parent, what the parent said about DELEG, and it might even report an error or whatever. We have all these error reporting now. But again, the big difference here between direct and indirect is the resolver is only going to trust one of those 2 parties. Next slide. And then the mixed one is that the parent might have DELEG records and might return hint records or both. The resolver, if it sees hint records, will go off and see if the child has DELEG records, and then we'll do some sort of mixing based on configuration. And the configuration might be trust the child more than the parent, trust the parent more than the child, do a round robin, whatever. That would be up to the resolver's configuration. Next slide, I think that's it. Okay, so my hope here is that when we are developing the protocol, that we choose exactly one of these. If we slide around during protocol development, the protocol is going to come out worse. It's going to be harder for the application developers to write, and it's certainly going to be harder for the resolver operators to figure out what the heck is going on. So please pick one. I said here before adopting a protocol design, in talking to the chairs, I think that sounds too much like a requirement. And in fact, I would say, please choose exactly one during the very beginning of protocol design. And, you know, that would be up to the working group. There'll be a call. Some people will say they want one or the other, but let's help the protocol developers by having one early so that the design doesn't slosh around. And that's it for this one.
So we actually have a couple people in the queue.
Okay. And do you want to take them or not? You had said not before, but
Yeah,
I'm totally
I think
fine.
we're good.
We have
Okay.
time.
Ralph?
Ralph Weber, Akamai. So I think some of what your draft has comes from the confusion we had with NS. And one of the goals was to not have that confusion again. So when you look at the current design solution, nothing says that something from the child should ever kind of override stuff that the parent says. It's always a strict top-down. It goes a bit sideways with the underscore DELEG, but it's still a directed graph. There's nothing that ever points back or overrides stuff. And I think delegation always has to come from the parent. And it can point to a child, but that's still kind of like the alias record. Still then, the original alias record comes from the parents, and then the child can decide how to spread out the actual kind of load for the name service that they want. But it's always parents. I think anything else will get in deep trouble.
Do you want people expressing opinions?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
We have
Great.
plenty of time.
Wes?
Wes Herdiker. Don't you think that we might end up in a case where some attributes need to be authoritative at the parent and some attributes within the DELEG record might need to be authoritative at the child, and there could be a discrepancy? I'm thinking of, like, you know, the worst case scenario I can imagine.
So then are you advocating for the mixed?
I'm not advocating, I'm asking a question.
Oh, no, I don't. I personally don't. But
So-
that may be a failure of imagination on my part. That's why I'm saying I think there are exactly these three, but if you can come up with an example that's not, then we should have a fourth.
I'm thinking that the working group in the process of defining the protocol will come up with an example of both, just knowing how we do.
Great, great. And at that point, like if we've sort of decided before or not, that's fine. Again, this could be just a lack of imagination on my part that there's only three. Ray Bellis.
Hi, yeah, Ray Bellis, I see. I'm also relatively agnostic on which of these is chosen, but do bear in mind that you can get situations where the parent and the child are actually the same server, and therefore it's very important to be able to actually, depending on the model, know which one actually returned the DELEG record, whether it's come from the parent or the child side of the zone cut.
Yep. Phil.
Philip Holmberg, NLNet Labs. You say that the recursive resolver is the only consumer of these records, but if we ever decide...
The only important one.
Yeah, well, important. But in any case, if we ever decide to put DNSSEC related material in the DELEG records, then a validator would also be a primary customer of these records.
Correct. Yes, I agree. I agree. I always, in my head, I think every validator is part of the resolver. And again, that may be me not being creative enough.
That is definitely not reality.
Sounds good. Yeah. So thank you for that correction. And I think we can split those out that way. Great. Thank you. Neil?
Hello, Riley. This is something outside of the discussion. I notice, and I want to bring it to the attention to whoever has to deal with it, that the QR code on at least one of the microphones in this room leads to a different session.
Yeah, Wes is busy reporting it to technical reporting, so yeah. Don't
Cool.
scan that.
Right. Don't scan bad QR codes. That's oh, wait, it was last month. It was Cybersecurity Awareness Month.
Yeah.
Peter?
Hi. It's a little low anyway. So you said in the first and the second model, you either trust the parent or the child in figuring out where the destination is for the delegation. So if you choose to only trust the child, well, you first get there by looking at the parent's hint. So it seems to me that it's not possible to only trust the child. And I wanted to raise that point to everyone's consideration in case people are considering the child-centric model. And then also the thing that Wes said, where there might be a split between certain parameters of the parent and the child. The ones you get from the child, I guess you still require, getting them still requires trusting the parent to find them at the child actually. So I think what's a good idea is to think about the trust model in arriving at the child to figure out the delegation. I think that's key in this discussion.
Great, thank you. I would love it if no one ever used the word centric in this discussion again, because centric means can be in one place, but we're really looking more in the other. And boy, has that messed us up in DNS op. 94, 99, that was really painful. So next. Okay, so completely switching gears here. We've seen proposals so far of using the omnibus like SVCB or SVCB-ish records. People not in proposals, but on the mailing list have also talked about that the DELEG information will come actually in discrete RR types. So I want to cover that here, again, not as a requirement, but for people thinking about it when we start doing development of the protocol. Next. So what I mean by here is an omnibus RR type is you're going to get a single record or a single type of records in an RR set that have subfields. So for example, in what we've seen so far, like there is an alias, an alias is one way in the same record as the transport, and there might be others, and these are subfields. And SVCB is that one writ large. And then the individual R types is what we've been doing forever. Oh, I've got a cool idea. I'll make a new RR type for it, and we will discuss it as a new RR type. Next. So the reusing SVCB so both of these have pros and cons, and weighing the pros and cons is well beyond me. But reusing SVCB, we already know how to parse these things. There will be some update if we do DELEG, but it's not like we're creating a new omnibus RR type here. And this is one of the concerns that's come up on the mailing list, is if we do that, then we are limited to the SVCB service parameters, which were not developed by us. They were developed by the HTTP people for their use. They seem to be doing just fine over there. But if we later come up with, we want to do this new kind of delegation, it had better fit into the service type parameters if we've chosen this. Next. Whereas for individual RR types, it's easy to do. It's what we do all the time. It's like, oh, I've got a great new idea. But each time you come up with a new RR type, you are forcing the authoritative developers to figure out how to parse it, for the zone file, how to display it. You're forcing the resolver operators to also be able to parse correctly and such like that. So that's the major trade-off between omnibus and individual RR types. Flexibility, do we trust our flexibility first, which we don't normally do with our individual RR types, but do we really want to force everybody to be able to parse a bunch of new records? And we don't know how large that is. Right now we've got two things that we're talking about, aliasing and transport. A couple of people on the mailing list have said, oh, when we're done with those, I want also to work on such and such. We might have 5 DELEG types. We might have 50. Don't know. Next slide. So using omnibus versus the discrete types has this cross-feature requirement and exclusions things, which for those of you who've dealt with PKICs before, like you have different PKICs options, but you can't have this one if you have this one, or you have to have both of these two. So what this slide is trying to cover is we're going to get into that situation. We know that, for example, it doesn't really make sense to alias and describe transports, because if you aliased, you already went over there. Or maybe it does, and we're going to actually do, so there will be, the features will be, have different delegation features will have some cross-feature interaction, and it's not clear if that's easier to do in an omnibus record or in discrete. We're going to be guessing here. Next. I want to emphasize that interactions with provisioning should be the last thing that we think about. Everyone's like, ooh, what about EPP? Don't worry about it. The people who care about that, they know how to do this. They're going to get this done regardless. But we do have to think about, if you're updating a single record in whatever provisioning protocol, then you have to know all of the features to go in that record. Whereas if you have discrete DELEG records, you can update one at a time. That doesn't necessarily mean you want to do that, especially if you go back to the last slide and you think about the fact that there is, in fact, cross-feature interaction. You might not want somebody to be able to update one without knowing what the one that it's interacting with, whereas they would know it if it was in one giant record. Again, none of this is clear, dunno. Next slide. One thing that, when people are like, oh, we need to know this now, we don't need to know this now. It is easy to convert between the two ideas as we are developing them. Obviously, we need to pick one. I shouldn't say we need to pick one before the end. If we have any sense at all, if we have any care about the future, we will pick one, not two. And I'm saying this as somebody who fought the S-MIME versus PGP wars. But if you're thinking of one and we decide to change the other one later, it's not a big deal. The hard part is going to say how resolvers deal with this information that are coming in. And again, I really want the working group to focus on two things. How is the resolver going to do this cleanly, clearly, with the least amount of configuration, et cetera, and then figure out what's the best way for the authoritative servers to tell them. Because at the end of the day, what we really want is delegation being acted on, not being done. The being done, we can do a little bit more work on to make the being acted on easier. Next. And that's it. So I have a preference on hearing from people who are actually developers rather than people who think they know design, because it's the developers who are going to have the hardest problem here, and I'm not one of them. So I don't need to stand here for this, right? You guys can do it? I mean, I'm willing to stand here, but I mean, yeah. I'll stand here.
That depends. Does anybody want to ask Paul a direct question as opposed to make a comment?
As compared to comment on choices? No,
You can always pop up if you want. DKG.
This is Daniel Cohen-Gilmore. Yeah, so I think there's an additional wrinkle here. Maybe it's sort of covered by Paul's slide on the feature relationships, but there may be multiple DELEG records referring to multiple delegations, as I understand it. And you may have different features that are attached to each one. So for instance, if you have one that says this one has a transport of DNS over QUIC, and this one has a transport of DNS over TLS, having those split out means you wouldn't be able to tie them to the other information. And so I don't see how you can get away with the individual piece. The omnibus seems like it's the only way to go to me. I think Paul's claim, I think that it is easy to translate between the two, I think is false. Because I think while it's easy to go from an omnibus to the discrete records, I don't think you can actually go the other way because you don't know how to match them back up if you have multiple records. So I think omnibus is the way to go.
Warren, are you cutting in line?
No, I'm Wes because I can't join data tracker workload.
You're
so
Wes?
He proxied for me.
Wow.
I know, isn't it awesome?
All right. Warren.
So Warren Kamari, Google, no hats. Apologies if I missed this, but I think one of the other differences is if you have an omnibus record, you can add sort of opportunistic information and you can provide it to the resolver as sort of additional stuff you might want to know. If you do it as individual records, each resolver has to query for all of the possible things that you might need to, or that it might be interested in. Is that correct, or did I just miss something? Okay.
Ralph Weber. So, I mean, the omnibus actually is extensible. It's extensible as the DGG said, that we can have multiple RR sets or multiple resource record in RR sets. So actually it is extensible in that direction. And it is extensible to actually adding new service parameters to the SVCB record as we've chosen so far. And the individual stuff, if for resolvers and authoritative servers' sake, they would have to kind of assemble all these different records in a single packet anyway because of speed, and that happens, I mean, with current DNS. So why not just go to an omnibus? And SVCP, given that 2 of the solutions are actually using it, seems a good choice.
Peter?
I see. I want to clarify, well, but I forgot what did you ask, DKG? Oh, yeah. There is certainly a way how to split the records and then put them back together, because you can always throw in an ID and use that to group the things to appropriate places, and then you can deduplicate and so on and so on. But I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm just saying that it can be done. And for the west, not west comment, Boren, yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. My brain stopped working. Yeah, multiple queries. Yes, it's also not necessarily true, because we can define that, okay, if the authoritative server gets the request, which is to be responded as a referral, the authoritative server will include more stuff. I mean, all of the records which are available, as it does with NS and DS, right? It picks, if the DS exists, it will shove the DS along with the NS into the referral. So that can be done as well. Again, might not be a good idea, but it can be done. My preference, let's figure it out after we get to the protocol part. I mean, that's a consideration, but I think that it needs more thinking instead of like 5 seconds at the mic line.
Tail?
Hi, Tail. I just wanted to also address exactly that, because the original DELEG proposal that we put out was taking advantage of the idea that you could opportunistically drop DELEG information into a referral response. And you could do that. I mean, we were proposing a new RR type that was going to do that. So even though I favored the omnibus approach, the way you can do it with the individual RR types is just say, well, when you're going to, delegate this opportunistic information, just drop it in your referral response. So.
And Ray?
Yeah, Ray Bellis, ISC. Kind of speaking with my RR expert review hat on, but not speaking for the rest of that group. Yeah, don't go for the multiple RR types. The omnibus one I think would work far better, and especially if the question outstanding over whether it's parent side or child side. Yeah, if it's parent side authoritative records, I think that makes it ineligible actually for expert review anyway, because that means you've got special processing, because resolvers, also authoritative servers, can't just treat it as an arbitrary RR type if it's got a special property of only being a parent side record.
Peter?
I see again. I think that one consideration is basically hinted at by DKG. If there is a property which is per delegation and is not tied to individual servers or endpoints or how we call them, then it might make sense to have like one RR, like prime example is DS in the current setup, right? The DS is for the delegation, and then you have individual NS records. So that kind of split might make sense, but that means that we will have like 2, not 25.
Right, and I think the big thing here is for us to, and I think a lot of people in the mic line, recognize this. That these are considerations we need to think about as we're doing the implementations. All right, so next on the agenda is Philip. He's going to talk about a comparison between 2 of the proposals. the right one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so my name is Philip Homberg, work for NLNet Labs, and we have two drafts that try to provide a solution that meets the requirements. There's the original draft that came out of the hackathon 1 year ago, and then slightly later, me and some colleagues made another draft that said, well, there's a completely different way to do it that also is going to meet the requirements. And what I'm going to focus on here is how both drafts, which are essentially very similar when it comes to the requirements, meet the requirements. And I detail a few of the differences, but later, better, I will have a slide deck that basically focuses on the differences of these drafts. Next slide. A small recap of what the two drafts are about. We have, say, a legacy delegation, which has an NS record, and then somewhere else we have A and quad A records for the delegated, for the name server. And then I use DELEG in capitals to refer to the draft that came out of the hackathon. And that draft basically introduces a new RR type called DELEG that goes, is a parent site record, and it's similar to NS and DS, and it gets sent by the authoritative whenever the authoritative sends a delegation. The alternative, which I will refer to as _DELEG, is to use the namespace to reserve a label _DELEG for delegations, and then basically you don't need any extra types. And because it is just a completely ordinary DNS operation, you don't need to require changes at the authoritative. I mean, you can do it, but it's optional. Next slide. And then the rest of this presentation basically follows the requirements document, goes over all of the requirements one by one. And I hope my interpretation of what the requirements are is fine, so that would be a good cross-check, because if I say something silly, then maybe we need to fix it in the requirements document. H1 for both drafts, basically nothing changes. I mean, the details of how you encode the delegation changes, but the overall concept that there are different zones and that they belong to different people and can be registered and all that stuff is the same. H2, backward compatibility. For both drafts, it's like if those new records are not present, then the implementation will just fall back to NS records. So it will be compatible with all existing zones out here. Then the next one, which seems very similar to so H3 seems very similar to H2, and we have interpreted that as old software is not confused by new delegations. Has been tried for the DELEG R-type, but yeah, if this interpretation of H3 is wrong, then I'd like to hear it. Next slide, please. Secure H4, DELEG must be able to secure delegations. At the moment, both drafts don't do anything extra with respect to DNSSEC. So the DS record in both drafts is left untouched. If we want to move information from the DS record to the DELEG records, then we need to have a draft that actually describes how that works. This H5 is how things work with updates. Basically, nothing changes there. It's just TTLs govern those records. They will just expire and will be fetched again by a resolver. Then there is an issue where there is, in fact, a difference, and that is about incremental deployability. in both cases, that there is no flag day required. I mean, you can just start adding it one by one. The difference is that _DELEG only requires basically changes in the recursive resolvers. You can add zones with _DELEG to without upgrading authoritative. It works with signers and stuff like that. And that's different for the DELEG RR type, because there you first have to upgrade your authoritative, make sure your signers know how to do it, and only then can you start serving those zones. So it's a slightly different model in how you deploy it incremental. Next slide. Multiple independent operators. So both approaches have multiple either DELEG or SVCB records. So you could use that for independent operators. There's one caveat, is that because DELEG is a completely new record, we can say that in alias mode, you can have as many as you like. Whereas the SVCB spec currently says that you should have only one. But I think that if we override this should in the specific case for DELEG, that's probably fine, but it's hard to say. If it would have said must not, then it would have been a problem, but the should is probably something that we can work with. Then we get, so these were the hard requirements. So I think both approaches have no problems meeting any of the hard requirements. For the soft requirements, first soft requirement is should facilitate the use of the new DNS transport mechanisms. Well, because it uses SVCB or an SVCB-like structure, that is easy to do. There is already an RFC that describes how to do DNS transport in SVCB, and that RFC can basically be adopted by the DELEG RR type to just basically say, well, use the fields as described in, what is it, RFC 9461. S2, DELEG should make clear all of the necessary details. Like I said before, we currently don't have anything for DS, so it's a bit debatable whether DS is required to contact the service, or that we should see DNSSEC as completely separate, but just pointing it out that this is just not in the draft at the moment. Next slide. Minimize transaction costs. So this is a clear win for the DELEG RR type, because the only way it can work is if the authoritative server will include it in a delegation. So it doesn't require any upfront extra queries. For _DELEG, there's many different scenarios that you can have. In sort of an end game scenario where authoritative servers understand the _DELEG, then it's basically also for free, because they will just include it. If you use unmodified authoritaves that don't understand _DELEG, then in some cases you will have 2 queries. In some cases you will have 1 extra query the first time you access a zone. Depends a bit on the configuration. It should, S4 should simplify the management of the zone's DNS service. Both proposals have an alias mode, and basically that allows a fairly static alias to put in the parents, and then the actual management of the records can be done in some infrastructure domain by the provider or providers that serve the zone. Let's see, S5, backward compatible to the conventional NS-based delegation mechanisms. In both cases, if you have a non-alias either DELEG or SVCB record, then it should have the information that you would need to synthesize NS records. So you could have only the DELEG and then synthesize NS. Of course, if you start using alias mode, then that information is not there, so then it doesn't work. Next slide. Extensible by design, SVCB and DELEG, because it follows SVCB, are extensible, so I don't think we have to say much about that. S7 should be able to convey a security model that is stronger. It's not completely clear what we need to do with that, because it's not sort of part of designing a DELEG implementation to redesign DNSSEC. But so the only thing I can say is that the DELEG, both approaches are protected by DNSSEC when the zone is signed, unlike sort of the current NS records at the parent. Next slide. Then the requirements document has a number of non-requirements that are also interesting to look at. Non-requirement is whether NS records must be a primary means for resolution, and in both approaches, the NS records are superseded when DELEG or SVCB records are present. Whether information is stored at the zone name or somewhere else, well, here the two approaches differ because the DELEG RR type is stored at the zone name in the parent side of that, and with underscore DELEG, it's a different namespace where things are stored. And then the final non-requirement is if you introduce a new record at the parent, whether or not that record could also be at the child. That's only an issue for the DELEG RR type, where it's only at the parent and not at the child, and the underscore DELEG draft does not introduce new RR types, so it doesn't create any issue in that respect. I think that's the end of my slide deck.
I have no more slides.
Yeah. So this is how we deal with it. If there's any immediate questions, you can ask them, and otherwise Petter will continue with the differences.
Oh, thank you for going through the requirements. I will try to dive into the little technical details which are different between the drafts, because I mean, both drafts check all the boxes. Now the question is which way we go. Yeah, next slide, please. You have just heard it. We are comparing the approach with the parent site type and the underscore DELEG subtree, which puts the information aside. Next slide, please. Throughout the presentation, I will attempt to have both solutions on one slide, and they will be divided by the thick line. So next slide, please. So in the upper part, we have the, let's call it legacy delegation with the NS. And on the right-hand side of the slide, there is always some note, so you can see, okay, which version of or which draft it is. So we have NS at the top. In the middle, we have the parent type DELEG. And yeah, SVCB, you have seen it. Next slide, please. And in the bottom part of the slide, we have the underscore DELEG SVCB. So here you can see that it's essentially the same information encoded a little bit differently. I mean, there's practically the only difference between the two drafts, and all the other properties are derived from this little but significant difference. When I say parent type, I mean the DELEG type. When I say special name or subtree or underscore DELEG, I mean the other draft which puts data aside. Hopefully that will become clear. Next slide, please. Visually, what the two drafts do is a little bit different because the way how they encode the information differs. So for the parent side draft, visually we keep the graph, the DNS namespace, as we are used to it, because it just puts the record next to the existing NS and that's it. For the underscore DELEG, it's within the same zone, doing like step aside. So if we had the DELEG in the root zone, we would have underscore DELEG label in the root zone. And from that, or underneath that label, we would have the information which points to the authoritative servers for a COM. Then in a COM, we would have underscore deleg.com with, and underneath that information, how to contact the example.com and so on and so on. Next slide, please. So, as we said several times, one of the proposals introduces new parent type, and that means changes, a lot of changes in different places. First, as a new parent type needs to be understood by signers, so we can actually sign it and protect the information. So that means that for the parent type, we need to modify the signer. Last weekend, over the hackathon, Andrzej Suri did an implementation for bind, and it was actually like literally 12 lines of code, because it's just finding the place where you special case the S in the signer and add like or the new number, and that's it. For subtree or the underscore DELEG, obviously that's not needed because it's just somewhere else. It's no special handling needed. Next, please. Validator is exactly the same story. For the parent type, we have to teach the validator what to do with it. In case of bind, like 3 lines of code, because where you have special case for the S, you add or the new number, that's it. Next slide will go into more details. Again, for underscore DELEG, that's not needed because it just works. Next, please. Now, the trouble is that with the new parent type, potentially there is a downgrade attack, because the attacker could pretend that the authoritative server is the old one which doesn't understand the new semantics and replay the proof of non-existence and blah, blah, blah. To protect against that, we've introduced in our draft a new flag, which is a signal to the validator that the validator either has to see a DELEG RR signature or proof of non-existence. So it's basically same story as for DS, except that it just indicates the new semantics is like enabled. So you have to insist on having the new proof of non-existence. Again, for the subtree proposal, that's not needed. Next, please. Aliasing, or I personally think that we should call it like more include, not alias, because if you have more than one operator, then alias doesn't really covers the semantics, but whatever. It works the same way, it's just encoded a little bit differently. For underscore DELEG, currently the text says use CNAME or SVCB alias, as Philip said. That can be redefined, that we will allow multiple aliases for SVCB0 if you want to point to multiple places, but essentially it's the same. Next, please. Yeah, and now we have like lots of new data like key value information or aliases, which currently don't have the representation in the registry. So the hard part is getting the data into the registry so we can generate zone file out of it. And that's exactly the same for both proposals, because the EPP and all the JES is the same, no matter how it's represented in a zone file. So the hardest part is unaffected of by whatever we do at the DNS level. Next, please. Now we have the new data in the zone file, so we have to serve it. For the parent type, we obviously have to modify the authoritative server so it understands that this is the parent type. On the parent side of the zone cut, it needs to be included in the referral responses and so on and so on. Again, our hackathon, Andrzej Suri implemented that for bind. That was roughly 300 lines of code, give or take. So it's doable. That as a proof of concept, it works. For the underscore DELEG proposal, no changes are required on the authoritative server, in theory, but then you will pay higher price because all the complexity shifts to the resolver, and the resolver has to do more work to get to the data. So it's like technically optional, but you might want to do that anyway. Next, please. Yeah, here's an example how the referral response looks like if we query for www.example.com and send the query to the com authoritative servers. it's basically the same. And the difference is that in the parent type proposal, you get the DELEG record type and the signature over that record in one go, and it has to be always. That's how the draft defines it. But for the underscore DELEG proposal, it's an optional optimization. So if you have an old authoritative server, it will serve only the traditional legacy referral. And then the resolver has to go and fetch the new place, from the new place, the new delegation information in SVCB record. So that's the optimization we talk about on the authoritative side. Next, please. That brings a question, okay, what happens if you don't deploy the new versions of the software to all the servers? And for the parent type, that's just not gonna work because the servers will not be providing the proof of non-existence or the signed data as required. So that will either cause retry and the resolver will try to find the server, one of the servers which actually provides the data, or it will just fail. For underscore DELEG, again, that's completely optional because the resolver has the ability to fetch the data, but that incurs more queries. Next, please. Here's a comparison of the worst case scenario where the resolver has an empty cache, doesn't know anything at all, and it tries to fetch the new delegation information through the chain from top down. And now for the parent type, it's basically the same query name minimization algorithm. There is one trick that the new resolver can send the new DELEG type number while minimizing to the old legacy authoritative server, and it will magically work because the existing authoritative servers don't have any special handling for the number we will assign. And that means that the legacy authoritative will consider that child side data because they don't know any better, and they will send back the normal referral NS, glue, and so on and so on. So it basically accidentally will work, but like accidentally because the spec says so. It's not like accident, like rolling a dice. For the underscore DELEG, in the worst case, the resolver has to go and fetch the information from two different places. So that means basically doubling the number of queries. If the resolver decides to optimize for latency and go and send the queries in parallel, it will be query for com_ns and com underscore DELEG SVCB in parallel and so on and so on. I will go into more details on the next slide, please. Oh, well, some other next slide. Never mind. The traditional query algorithm works as it used to work for the parent type proposal. You just send the full query, normal queue type to the authoritatives. You get the referral with all the information, no changes here. For the underscore DELEG, it's basically choice for the implementation, whether optimize for a latency, and then the parallel queries are way to go, and the parallel queries sort of require query name minimization of sorts, because you don't know where the zone cut is, so you have to like issue the queries for all the possible places to find out whether there is something or not. Or there are like clever tricks how you can optimize if you do the query sequentially and don't care about the latency, but I'm not going there. We can discuss on mic. Next, please. So to sum up, the resolution algorithm for the parent type approach is the same. It just works like that. No changes required. For the underscore DELEG proposal, the complexity is actually in the resolvers because it requires like heuristics to optimize the number of queries. So it doesn't have to send 2 queries all the time. But if it gathers enough information about the state of the authoritative zone and the support on the authoritative servers, it might choose and optimize the behavior and send like less queries because the authoritative server will be cooperating in certain cases. In short, it boils down to discovering and catching information about presence of the underscore DELEG subtree in the parent zone and the special handling support for underscore DELEG on the authoritative server the resolver is talking to. Next, please. if we look at the number of queries required by the resolver to fetch the new delegation for the parent type record, it's the same as it was. So it's just one query per level in the tree, no magic here. For the underscore DELEG, it's the heuristics. So I'm not going to go through the table in full, but basically, if the author server is cooperating and the zone is signed, or if you do some hex in the zone with a wildcard, you can get to one query in the optimal case. But in other cases, especially if the author site was not updated with the special handling for the underscore DELEG, you end up with more queries. Again, we can discuss all the rows in the table if you want on mic. Next slide, please. So I will try to sum up. Basically, it's the question of the trade-off we are willing to do when designing and deploying the protocol, because the parent type approach on the parent side of the zone cut basically says enough is enough. NS is not signed. We are going to tackle it like in place, go the hard way, and introduce new parent type, which means that we need to sign it. That means changes in signers, validators, and authoritative servers to properly sign and serve the new zone. And the benefit it gives is basically the optimal query count behavior in all scenarios, because then you did the hard work upfront in the implementation. So then it pays off by having like single query for every step in the tree or every level in the DNS tree. The underscore DELEG kind of, for lack of better terms, like sidesteps the issue by putting the information aside, a different place than the traditional delegation was. And that avoids the need to modify the signer, modify validator. So that's a little bit easier on the code side, because basically that requires only changes in the resolver to deal with to find the information, but it doesn't require any changes on the authoritative side, theoretically. But if you don't do any changes to the authoritative side, you will end up with the resolvers doing more queries. So I would say that you probably want to deploy eventually the changes to the authoritative side, because that will allow you to limit the number of the queries eventually once the rollout is done. So it's basically shifting the complexity. Either you spread it across the signer, validator, authoritative server, and resolver in the parent type, or you say, okay, we want to touch only the resolver and shift all the complexity to the resolver. And that's basically the trade-off we need to decide which way we want to go. And the consequences of this is that for the parent type, before you deploy the parent type to a particular zone, so say, if I'm allowed to dream and say that the COM is going to use this, the COM operator would have to upgrade all the authoritative servers before introducing the DELEG parent type into the zone. Otherwise, it might break. But on the other side of the spectrum, we have the underscore DELEG proposal, where you can introduce the new SVCB records in the underscore DELEG subtree without upgrading the authoritatives for the parent zone first. So that's the trade-off. And I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so again, this is the visual difference, but I think we can go back if you can, because that's probably more informative. We can jump between the slides if necessary. So now what do we do? It's maybe now I need to, the proper share, because I mean, we are here, there's the political layer. It's like, it's more like, now what?
Any comments, questions?
I have a question.
We'll get in the queue.
Oh, sorry. Do I have to?
Ben.
Hi, Ben Schwartz, Meta. I just wanted to bring up the question of how you turn this on and how scary it is to turn on. I think a big challenge with DNSSEC has been that if you're not totally confident in your configuration, you worry about causing an outage in the moment when you actually try to activate it. And both of these proposals actually carry some kind of zone-wide flag, right? The existence of the _deleg subtree or the like DNS key flag in the parent, so that we still, both of these proposals have some kind of situation where the operator has to like make a call, flip a switch, and hope everything is still working. But I think it's interesting to think about the differences here in how scary it is to turn this on for the first time.
Sure.
I agree that there is a point where something will change from the point of the resolver in both proposals. Either the resolver will detect that the _deleg exists, or it will see that the flag is on, and then it will trigger like new code path in the resolver. But honestly, I don't see how we can make any progress at all without having some sort of change in the resolver, because the reason why we are trying this is to convey more information to the resolver. So no matter what we do, eventually the resolver will have to hit the new code path because it will be doing something with the new information. And then, yeah, I just don't know what to do. And it seems to me that it's like fundamental property of what we are trying to do. So I hear the concern, I will think about it, but I don't really see what can be done right now.
Peter?
Okay, so another implication of the _deleg approach, I think, is worth pointing out, which is the namespace overloading. I'm not saying that's an issue, but the namespace would be less usable than before. There would be like the prefix that you can't use as a regular zone name. The maximum child domain name would be reduced by 1 label and by I think 7 octets. I'm not saying all of these are issues, but I find it interesting that if the goal is to express relationships within a graph, that would require overloading that graph. So that's an interesting thing that I wanted to point out. And yeah, so that overloading and the other potential downsides, like the extra queries and all of that, I think are symptoms of a less integrated solution, which makes it easier to roll it out because it requires less upgrades on the auth. And so I think the main question is that benefit, which is mainly quicker timing in rollout, worth whatever the downsides are? And I think we have not had a discussion about what the rollout target would be, because on the one side, folks say, okay, eventually people will want the upgrade anyway, because then they save the extra query. So eventually authoritative servers will upgrade, and until then there will be backwards compatibility anyway, because NS isn't going away. And the zones that do care, like big parent zones, delegation centric, they probably control the zone content and the software, so they might update more quickly. So maybe it's not such an issue. And so, yeah, I think we should have a discussion about, do we want to make something simpler, to make it more quick to roll out, or are we okay with big adopters doing their thing if they see fit for it in terms of time, and otherwise just wait? I don't know.
So one comment, and sort of that's also a bit related to what Ben was referring at, is that, I mean, upgrades to some extent just have their own pace, and any operator can decide whether they want to upgrade something, or vendors can decide to upgrade. But another way of looking at it is what is the operational complexity. And I think with the _deleg, it's basically a performance optimization if you upgrade. It doesn't completely break, it's just, well, you get more traffic, and then it's like, okay, we need to do something about it. Whereas with the DELEG RR type, if you use an old signer, I've no clue what breaks, but it could be very confusing. How do operators get feedback that they used the wrong signer? If you use an old authoritative somewhere in your network and it breaks, like how do you get feedback that one of your authoritaves was actually, for whatever reason, not upgraded? And if we look at the entire DNS spectrum, then of course all of the major DNS providers, they will get it right, but there's a gazillion small parties that barely know what they're doing. And I think there is the risk for sort of a more complex upgrade path, that people will get it wrong, start talking about how complex it is and stuff like that. So that's why I would prefer a more gentle upgrade thing, like, well, yes, it's a performance optimization, but by and large, if you get it wrong, it will still work.
Dwayne. Yeah, thanks, Dwayne Wessels. I wanted to get a sort of a sanity check on an assumption that I had been making about _DELEG. I had assumed that it would work if _DELEG was itself a delegated zone rather than in the parent zone itself. Is that still true? Because the slides today seem to indicate that it would always be a part of the parent zone.
I don't think you can actually delegate _DELEG because you get an infinite recursion. My guess is, but I don't know, we didn't try that, is that _DELEG could probably be a DNAME. That should be safe.
All right, thanks.
But yeah, delegating _DELEG would not be good.
Okay.
I'm sorry that I flew the stage because there is terrible echo and I have a hard time understanding what people say. So I can answer any questions or react, but I will be here because it's much easier to understand for me here than on stage.
Lars?
Good thing that you're down here, Peter. Since you moved us up to the political layer, Lars Lieban from NetNode, by the way. Is there any kind of attitude difference between those proposals that shifts the level of autonomy for the child in its relation with the parent? Are we shifting control from the child to the parent or vice versa? And if we do we want to look at traditional DNS to try to make a change that is, if we make a change, it's very, very well thought out and intended, or just try to maintain that balance that we have? I'm not sure that there is any difference, but I want to ask the question.
I think that the DELEG archetype draft implicitly picked option 1 of Paul's classification, because it basically describes like the parent is doing stuff. There's nothing like the child is doing stuff. It's not part of the model. And in our draft, because it is SVCB and that is completely open-ended, we didn't want to deviate from the DELEG archetype draft in that way because it's a completely separate discussion. So both drafts implicitly have Paul's option 1, and I think it can be changed in the other 2 options easily, but that would be work that needs to be done somewhere, maybe a different draft or in the same, or in the draft that gets adopted or whatever.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Eric.
Eric Nygren. Well, this has a lot of gain on this mic. Both of these look like they'd work. I think one thing that jumps to mind is which of these would be easier to maintain and test and debug going forwards. Like looking at like if 20 years from now we're trying to kind of be maintaining this, the thing that really worried me was the table that showed kind of the simple case for the RR type version, and then the like 15 different variants for what the data, the flows might be like with the name version. And that made it kind of seem like that name version might be kind of have more corner cases that could break things or be trickier to debug or go wrong, and that years from now we might be unhappy with. I think there's also a sharp edge with the name version that by having the kind of overloading the namespace, like having the underscore label is great in many cases. I think there's a sharp edge here that if there were zones out there that didn't have an adequate safeguards for people to prevent underscore labels from being registered. So if you that there might be a case where people might go and register that underscore DELEG zone, and then weird things might happen. Like we could mention that in security considerations, but it seems like a sharp edge that's present in the name case, but not the type case.
So I think for delegating the underscore DELEG label, it has to be in the final document that underscore DELEG is reserved and cannot be delegated. There's a caveat that it might be a DNAME, but it's definitely something that cannot be done. Of course, there might be an accidental problem there, but yeah, I guess there's more requirements that we just have to follow, otherwise things break. So I don't think that's. When it comes to the queries, the table is long because it tries to do a performance analysis. So of course, for performance analysis, you have to look at every possible combination. But for a resolver, it's basically, there's three options. Either the resolver can send two queries in parallel, it can send one query after another, or it sends only one query. So I think that eventually for the resolver path, it will not be that bad and that hard to understand. And then, of course, within the resolver, there is a bit of policy to see which one it should take. But if you then actually look on the wire, then you see like, okay, do I see the two queries or do I see one query? And if it fails, then the only way it can fail is it sends one query to an authoritative that doesn't know what to do, and somehow the second query didn't happen. So yes, there's definitely extra complexity compared to the DELEG type, but I think it's a modest amount of extra complexity.
So Warren Kamari without any hats. So looking at these two, it feels to me as though sort of the type one is more architecturally pure, whereas the second one is a really cool and awesome hack in order to get this deployed faster. And I think I've got sort of a similar view, or possibly a similar view to Peter Thomason, where I think this comes down to a tension between, do we want this launchable soon? Or do we want this sort of 20, 30 years, we look back on this and go, that was the right decision? And I think that's sort of where we are. Like, I think the name thing is great because we can get it deployed soon and quickly and it'll just work. But I think we might be sort of optimizing for short-term versus long-term.
I think another way of looking at this is that this is how DNS should have looked in the first place. Well, probably not with a label called underscore DELEG. But the whole concept that the resource record can be at the parent, even though the name logically belongs to the child, I think is something that is a design decision. It makes DNS hard to understand in many cases. If you look now at DNSSEC validation, you have NSEC records, could be at the parent, could be at the child, have the same name, RR6 over those NSECs, and yes, have the same property. So we have created a confusing design, and I would say that underscore DELEG is basically reducing the confusion. But we're not used to it, so it looks ugly to anybody who's not used to it.
Paul? Paul Hoffman. So I'm going to try to jump back from various comments. Let me start with Warren's. I like the underscore, but not because it's fast, but in fact, because it's much easier to test. There's only one system we have to test, which is resolvers. With the DELEG type, in order to test things, we need to test a set of authoritative servers and make sure, to see how they are announcing the DELEG record, and resolvers to see how they're doing it. With the underscore type, regardless of, and I don't care about speed of doing it. Here we are in 2024. We could have thought of this 10 years ago. Doesn't matter. I tend to like things that are easier to test. with my background of running consortia that ran interoperability things and such like that, I would love to have a one-sided test instead of a two-sided test. And that also goes back to what Eric Nygren was saying. I think that even though _DELEG is harder to implement in resolvers, the fact that it's only in the resolver and therefore you can see whether resolver is doing it right turns out to be way easier than looking at the interactions between resolvers and servers, because setting up _DELEG zones is trivial to do. And you could even try fuzzing those and see how it affects a resolver. You're still only testing one side of the two sides of the interaction. So my preference just on a, are we going to get this right? Not how fast, you know, again, disagreeing with Warren that we might do it just to get it out quickly. On day one, when someone turns this on, they only have to turn it on in the resolver. And that goes back to what Ben was concerned about. You know, we're going to be worried about this, but we only, you know, the resolvers can switch between I'm in _DELEG mode or I'm in traditional, classical, old, however you want to call what we're doing now mode. And it doesn't then matter what the authoritatives are doing. Authoritative could put up _DELEG at any point and everyone ignores it. Doesn't matter.
Right?
Roy Adams from ICANN. Paul Wouters suggested something a while back, and that is to shoehorn, for lack of a better term, the entire DELEG proposal into a DS record and just give it a new digest type. I haven't seen a proposal for it in a data tracker, but at least that's a third proposal. It's also a bit extreme in my humble opinion, but I just want to point out that that one is there. Now, having said that, what I see from both proposals, DELEG and _DELEG, is that it tries to encapsulate everything possible under the sun, right, under the name of extensibility for future use, right? So I want to point one thing out here. It is possible to do DNSSEC related things in DS. So one very nice feature of the entire DELEG proposal is DS aliasing. And Peter van Dijk and also Paul Wouters have pointed out that you can do DS aliasing in a DS record simply by a new digest type. Peter van Dijk, I think he calls it digest type verbatim. But it basically leaves the rest of DELEG for all the transport stuff and all the things you want to do, all the things you need to know when you reach the server, right? Whereas the DS type stuff helps you with everything you need to know for the validator. I just want to point out that's an interesting distinction, and I think we need to consider that. Thank you.
DKG?
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. I was going to say roughly what Roy said there. If the trade-off is, as Warren described it, between optimizing for can we roll this out now, or it'll take a while to roll it out, versus the complexity costs that we incur on the system in the long term, the suggestion of, you know, it sounds like all of the upfront costs that might delay from the type proposal have to do with saying, as Peter said, change the part where it says, if this is a DS record, do DS record, or it's a DELEG record. And so you don't even have to make that change if this is a new pseudo digest for a DS record. And then that seems like it leaves us with a better architectural arrangement, and it removes the upfront cost of updating all the authoritatives. So if those really are the trade-offs as Warren described, in the chat, it didn't sound like everyone was in agreement with that, but if they are, it seems like we can have our cake and eat it too, as long as we're willing to just pretend that something is a digest when it's not.
Wes?
Wes Hardiker, speaking with only my operator hat on. I do operate about 20 zones, one of which is kind of important. There's some other differences that should be considered, and if I missed it, I apologize, but there's a difference in the negative caching of records that don't exist in a long-scale deployment. And so the advantage of something like a _deleg subzone is that I can offload the queries where I can put a very long TTL on the NS record or the DELEG record for the subzone in order to get all of those queries to go off to a different location served by a different set of infrastructure, as opposed to an R type that's going to the same parent. So I'm getting two queries, and especially when the TTL for the record may be significantly different than the TTL in the negative caching TTL in the SOA. And I actually don't know what I prefer yet. This is just one other point to consider, is that in a long-term rollout, which I suspect we will have, especially at things like TLDs and routes, there will probably be a lot of extra queries generated by either of these solutions, and there's sort of some subtle ways that you could actually help articulate load balancing properly.
Yeah, better go first.
Can I react to us? For negative caching, I probably don't understand what you are trying to say, because with the parent type, you don't get the separate query, so there is nothing to cache. You get normal referral with TTL on it and proof of non-existence, which has some TTL on it. Up to you what NSEC TTL you choose. You can do whatever you want from 0 to 2 to the power of 31. So I think that that's some sort of misunderstanding. For _DELEG, there is a different query, so you have to worry about the separate caching, but the caching already happens for the proof of non-existence on the parent type, and there is like no extra record you have to keep in cache. On the contrary, for the _DELEG, you potentially are filling the cache with like negative entries for every single zone, which is not having the new delegation, because I mean it's a separate query, right?
Yeah, Raphael, I want to address Paul's comment. So actually, I don't think it is true that you can really just test that in one side, because at the end, even with the _DELEG proposal, you have to change authoritative servers to get the correct answers. And the other thing is, whoever has done DNS, writing an authoritative server is relatively easy. Writing a resolver is relatively complex. Resolvers are already, because they have to deal with all the stuff that is out there that is non-standards compliant, they're already so complex. Adding more complexity there, I think, introduces a much greater risk than kind of changing the authoritative server. And as we've seen, kind of, there was work done by IC over the weekend to kind of tackle the authoritative side. So that seems to be easier.
Peter?
Again. Well, I have to say that we've also tried to implement the resolver side and gave up because it was too much for the hackathon. So that's an indication that the complexity is actually in the resolver. And we were trying to implement the parent type proposal, not the more complex _DELEG. So I agree with Ralph that the complexity is actually in the resolver, no matter what we do. So from my perspective as the blind developer, having extra complexity to shorten the rollout period is not a good trade-off, because it's already complex like hell. I don't want more complexity than I absolutely have to introduce.
So we had a student making a proof of concept of _DELEG in Unbound. And that student only had a few weeks, maybe a month for the entire project. And of course, the student started with no knowledge at all about Unbound. So I think it's relatively easy to do _DELEG. And of course, the Unbound code base is brilliant, so that's why it was so fast. So yeah, I think it's quite doable. It's not a massive change to how recursive resolvers work.
All right. Any other other comments on these two presentations? All right. Thank you. I actually wanted to thank Philip and Peter for taking the time over the weekend to kind of change the way that they were going to present their material. I think it was actually very useful to think about things both in terms of how it aligns with the requirements and how they compare to one another. I certainly think some of the conversations we had today were useful, even though I think in the chat I see several people going, now they really don't know what they think, which is fine. This is why we're here, to talk about these things and work them out. Plans going forward, Dwayne and I will, like I said, we will get a working group last call started on the requirements document probably in the next few weeks. And since if we start it then, we will also run into the US Thanksgiving holiday. We'll probably make it an extended working group last call and run it for maybe 4 weeks with several pesters from the chairs to make sure we do get comments on it. The goal there is not necessarily, as Tail was saying earlier, the goal is not necessarily to push it forward, to publish as an RFC right away. The working group last call is to make sure that we actually cover the material that we know we need in order to move forward in either developing solutions or assessing solutions. So we'll probably do the working group last call, and then it'll park for a little bit in case we have to reopen it for some reason. And we can keep moving forward with discussions of solutions. So with that, any other topics or comments people have before we wrap up?
I have a process question, because now we have 2 proposals, well, actually 3, because the shoehorn everything into DS is also technically valid approach. But I would like to know what the room thinks, or what, which way we lean to, whether it's like worth putting more text or like working on text for either of these 3 proposals, or whether we just, close the room and go home because it's not going to, we are not going to find any consensus or whatever. So basically my question is, we have half an hour almost. So can we try to find out what people think, whether one of these approaches is like consensual sort of in the room, or I don't know.
I would actually highly encourage people to have that conversation while we're here. It's far easier to interact in person than it is to do asynchronous email. So if people want to keep talking, we will certainly stay here until we get kicked out.
Okay, maybe but the question is, what do we do, like process-wise? Eventually, at what point do we try call for adoption, for example, for a working group, or what do we do? I mean, and when? I don't have the answer. I'm just thinking aloud, because it's, we've spent a year working on the requirements, but I'm an engineer. I like to work on the protocol. So, but tell me which protocol it is, so I can develop the, the actual code for it and test it, as Paul pointed out. So it's like, yeah, Paul, thank you.
Paul?
So I have a proposal, which is that we don't go too fast on starting the discussion of the protocol, but we prepare for that just the exact way that the 2 presenters did earlier, which might be a common draft of all of the bits that are common, and then the 2 different proposals. And if Paul Wouters or somebody like Paul Wouters wants to do the 3rd one of shoehorn into a DS, they can participate in that. But I think that once we have the set of differences, which again, the presentations were great for, that will help the working group decide more not just which direction do we want to go, but why we want to go in a particular direction. And I know I'm volunteering you to do a bunch more work, because it's writing work. It's not actually the fun development work. But I think that would help the working group the most, is if we really were deciding on differences, not on 2 separate proposals.
if I can react to that, we've just presented the differences. So what's missing? I mean, because we just done the work and you are asking me to do it again, or I don't understand what's missing. I mean,
what's missing is everyone who's not in the room who didn't see the presentation.
yeah, I mean, there's why we have recordings, right?
Okay, well,
I mean, we can create a transcript of the presentation, sure, but I don't want to spend another year writing down what I've
if it was
summarized in
going to
15
take you
minutes.
another year, I would volunteer to help and cut it down to a week.
Well,
I'm
then-
proposing that if we're doing this on the mailing list, to me, it's not fair to say to everyone on the mailing list, go back and look at the presentations. If the working group is comfortable with that, if there's a sufficient number who are here and it's a smaller number on the list, that's fine. And then we can start again. Then I, if that's where we're going, I would change my proposal to we decide based on diffs, not on the 2 drafts that are out there.
Andrew.
Hi, Andrew Campling, 419 Consulting. Just since a number of us put it in the chat, I wondered whether the chairs would consider using the show of hands tool whilst we're gathered here, just to get a sort of sense of the room.
So I actually did put a message in the chat. I can certainly do a show of hand between DELEG and _DELEG, but I also did see a couple of comments go flying by about another proposal that either hadn't been submitted or hadn't been published or something like that. If we want to leave that one out for the time being, we can certainly do a show of hand between these two. It'll just take me a second. Roy?
Roy Adams, better ask for feedback. So here it comes. Personally, it feels like the _DELEG is indeed a fast track to trying to get a similar solution as DELEG is. So that's my gut feeling. I do have some comments on the DELEG proposal itself. If we're going to allocate a new type code, sorry, a new RR type for parent signed only, I think we need to allocate a range. Not necessarily because we're going to split all the functionality in this new and all of these new types, but if we have to do this again in a couple of years for yet a new type, and of course we all hope that DELEG is extensible enough that we don't have to do that, but I'm sure someone will propose something that doesn't fit into the current DELEG proposal. So I would like to have a whole range for future use. The third thing is the DNS key flag. I do know we need to have that, but I want to make it more generic. If there's a DNS key flag, that specific DNS key flag in the DELEG proposal, it just needs to signal that there always should be an NSEC, an authenticated denial. So all of these types that are parent side only can then be denied or prove that it's there in one go. I also would love to have the DNSSEC related stuff split out. The DNSSEC related stuff, like the DS aliasing, that could literally be a digest type, and then the validator can digest the digest type, and the resolvers can deal with transport. All right, that was my feedback.
So Warren Kamari with my Ops AD hat. I just wanted to quickly say how impressed I've been with everybody in the working group so far. And like, it feels like we're all working together and listening to each other. And I very seldom say things like this, but this working group's going so much better than I was expecting. And thanks everyone for, working well together, etc.
All right, so we're going to push a poll out, so everybody should be prepared to use Meet Echo. What we're going to do is ask a question very similar to what Michael had mentioned in the chat. do you have a preference based on today's presentations? This is really just for us to have a good, a better understanding of how people feel. And this is certainly not a binding decision in any form or fashion. So we'll give everybody a couple of minutes to. Does anybody else think we need theme music going on when we do a poll? Warren, that's an action item for you. So I'm not sure if I'm more impressed with the fact that 102 people responded, or we actually got as clear of an answer. So I thank you for voicing that opinion, but I think this is also a good indication that some of the discussions we had today was very useful.
Yeah, but we didn't get 100. We got 100 is the total.
Oh, right, right.
Yeah.
Still. All right, so that's very useful. Anybody have any thoughts, comments, closing remarks?
The show of hands is a non-binding tool. This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. Is there any reason why we can't see whether there is a preference for the type or the name proposal among the 44 people who have an opinion at this point? Sometimes at the IETF, we spend a long time debating something, and when you finally go and ask around the room about who prefers option A or option B, turns out no one provides option B, and no one prefers option B, and we've all just been devil's advocating it the whole time. It would be nice to know if there is a consensus among the 44 that one or the other thing is desired. My suspicion is that there won't be an answer, but why not ask it right now? It's not binding.
We can. Are you prepared for the odd answer you'll get?
I don't know what answer would be odd. If the answer is we're evenly split, hey, I've been there before. This is the IETF.
Yeah. Good point.
So I'm gonna do that. We'll do 2 polls, one for each one.
Since this room is ridiculously large, I'll just point this out on mic. It might make more sense in that spirit to ask 2 separate questions of yes, no for DELEG and yes, no for service binding versus yes for one and no for the other. Because of that matrix, there may be strong support for both. There may be lukewarm support for neither that a one-off question won't capture.
Which one are you doing? To the underscore first. Yep. You ready? Yep. Okay. It'd be nice if it tallied the total number of votes instead of.
All right, so maybe I'll apologize to DKG and say I'm surprised by this result.
Can you put up the results page that shows all three of the result sets? But yeah, I was going to say the same thing. You got it, DKG. It's exactly what you wanted. Yes.
This is DKG. So I'll just say at the mic line what I said in the chat. It looks like there's a lean in this group towards the type draft and not towards the name draft, but that doesn't mean that it's consensus. Right. It's clearly not a consensus. If you're an implementer, you can choose what you want to try to implement and see if it works and if it makes sense. If you only have the capacity to implement one of these, if I were you, I'd try to implement the one people are leaning towards to get a jump on that, and then you can give feedback. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work. Right? But I don't know how many implementers we have here, but like, let's try to get some stuff in play and see if we need it done.
So Wes, we don't actually see a button here to share results, so. What's that? Okay. All right, so yeah, so kind of echoing what DKG said, it does seem like we have an interesting lean here to be considered. Route, well, never mind. Okay. So I would encourage people to start thinking about how they want to approach this solution space, since we do have documents here that we can start working on. And maybe the thing to do is start having that conversation on the mailing list, you know, in parallel with the working group last call and the requirements. I certainly think that everybody has made a good effort and put in a lot of time making sure that we got through that requirements phase, and I want to thank everybody for that. And so I think this is where we get to say now the fun begins, for some definition of fun. So Paul.
I think Peter's first.
Oh, Peter's first.
Hi. Does anyone feel we should do the same show of hands exercise with on the topic of Paul's first presentation with a different? No? Okay. I mean, if people don't feel like.
Let the developers jump in and such like that. I think it'll come up later. What I got up to say is, since it does seem like we are, you know, that there are developers for both drafts and such like that with implementations, it would be really handy if the chairs would set up either a GitHub page or something that's editable for testing. So, you know, for the people doing the all caps DELEG, you know, people who are doing the authoritative side, people who are doing the recursive side, or for underscore DELEG, people who are doing the recursive side, because of course it's fairly trivial to set up the authoritative side on that, to have a public testing page so that if someone is doing a quiet development and doesn't want to show people and such like that, they can find servers and resolvers to test against.
So the working group does have a GitHub repo, and it is free for use for anybody who wants to take advantage of it and create a working repo off of it. I know that the requirements document has already done that, so we certainly encourage people to use that as much as they can. All right. Final chance for comments. Any words from our esteemed area director? Wes thinks that Warren has a comment to make, but I don't believe him. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Anybody have any questions about the Git repo or anything from running the working group, feel free to find Dwayne and I. I think we're here all week. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your IETF meeting. Thanks for coming.
Som du föredrar. Först att snabbast till. Signal.
I wish turn it off back there. Yeah, I wish you could turn it off here though. Yeah, it's very sensitive. I thought it was whispering to you, and it showed up in the transcript. Well, let's relax a little bit now, or you probably have more.
I have a BOF tomorrow morning. Won't be too bad. Well, who knows?